with what I saw there. Um, and then I don't recall. Someone contacted me. Yeah, that's right. I guess somebody I knew said, "Hey, you think you're interested in checking this out?" And, I said, "Sure." So, yeah.
What was you? What, I'm just curious. I was actually president of college Republicans here at Tulane in the 1970s, if you can believe that. That's how old I am. I was actually
Sure.
the second president of Tulane College Republicans, and the transfer between the first and the second president couldn't have been more radical. The first president of college Republicans was what we would now call a rhino. Uh, she dedicated her entire life to fighting David Duke, and I became one of his earliest supporters. And I'd like to think I'm part of the reason he ultimately came to identify as a Republican. And that it's just kind of one of these weird twists of history. Her name was Beth Rickey. Uh, she ended up having a very tragic life. She died in a motel in Santa Fe about 10 years ago. Very young. She's just like my age or maybe a year or two older. But what was you? But basically, I I really believed that the Goldwater Republican Party was real. And I loved the fact I was born in the South, and I loved the way Goldwater basically got the whites of the South behind him in 1964, and gave people in the South, at least, hope. And Arizona, you're in Arizona. It's five southern states, and including Louisiana and Arizona, that went for Goldwater in '64, and so we're connected by that little bit of history. And then by the time when Reagan was finally elected, I mean, I had been at the Republican National Convention in '76, '80, and '84, and by the time of his end of his first term in office, I realized that Reagan was not going to restore a white America at all.
Well, and that's so. Here, here's a viewpoint I had kind of thrust upon me when I was taking a college class, and I can't recall exactly what it was, but the instructor had said, the Republicans tended to be on the immigration issue, assimilationists, and the Democrats were multiculturalists. And I said, well, I don't want either. I believe in American nationalism, and so neither party really stood for the American nation. They were both basically saying we are the United States, and they're claiming some authority over the American nation, which I don't necessarily accept. That merely because they declare somebody that they've brought onto this continent and declared to be a citizen, that they're an American. And I didn't believe that. I don't believe that. I believe that there is an American nation. There is the heritage American nation. Um, we're part of it, and it's an ethnic nation, whether the people like it or not. And I think if you go back historically, even that was pretty much the view of the founders. Now, I'm willing to say that, like any kind of political document, the Constitution was a compromise. There were people that wanted to make whites strictly the only people who were eligible for citizenship, and that didn't happen in the compromise. And Thomas Jefferson put it into the 1792 Immigration Act, if I recall. Um,
I thought it was
but
early. I thought it was even earlier than that, like 1789. It was one of the very first things that the first Congress passed was a law on citizenship, and only white people could be admitted.
and so I take a different viewpoint that I think that a lot of Americans, in that I do believe that there is an ethnic American nation. We are part of it. When I went to school, in the '60s, like I guess like you, we were learning American history, which is the history of Europeans spreading across the continent. And then after, say, 1969-ish time frame, when there was the Watts riots and all of that, they stopped telling American history and we started having social studies. And eventually, at some point, we went back to history, but it was a very different history that was being told in public schools. So I think, I think we need to make a clear distinction between citizenship and nationality, and the law really does make a clear distinction between that. We just have to make the demands under what is rightfully ours to say we are an ethnic nation, and they have to respect that. Because, and another point on that, which is also somewhat legal, is the United States is signatory to a number of treaties that require it to recognize nationality, ethnic nationality and such. So, that we're morally right on this issue. They just need to come around and accept what's right.
Which treaties do you have in mind that we are signatories to? Are you talking about the Genocide Treaty by any chance?
Universal Declaration of Human Rights and various treaties engaged in with the United Nations.
Well, I mean, the only one that springs to mind initially is one of the most controversial things that ever came out of the United Nations, which is the so-called Genocide Convention, which is kind of fascinating. I believe it was originally adopted in '48, not really implemented in the United States until I think 1984 under Reagan. But who does it really favor? This is the problem. I mean, if we recognize a right to ethnic identity, one of the very first campaigns that was launched from the United States to the United Nations was launched by W.E.B. Du Bois, who said that black lynching in the United States was a form of genocide.
He can make any claim he wants. There was also white lynching. Whites were lynched. Lynching was a common practice when the rule of law failed to be adequately practiced by the governments in the various locations. The people rose up and enforced the law themselves. It still goes on. What you might call "quote unquote" lynching goes on in many other countries. Extrajudicial or extra governmental kind of enforcement of rules and laws, norms. It still goes on.
Well, the Muslims have a very famous version of it called honor killing.
Yeah.
Different
societies have different ways of I used to, for example, discuss with leftists a lot of times, they'd say such things as, you can't legislate morality. And I would say, you don't understand what law is. Law is encoded morality. Law is normative. It reflects culture and values of the people who create those laws, and it encodes what they believe is right and wrong. So
you have a very sophisticated way of approaching that. What's your academic background?
I'm a computer science background, technical largely, but it took me a while to get through college. So every year or so, every time I had to take classes, I'd also add on a couple classes in political science and in other areas, just to supplement my knowledge in these other areas.
When you refer to law as normative, it sounds like you've got at least some background in sociology or anthropology.
I've taken classes in anthropology. I consider myself a philosopher, quote unquote. I really enjoy understanding, especially ethics is a favorite subject of mine. And I think it helps definitely inform what is the relationship between people and the law. And the fact is, it is, quote unquote, normative. It reflects the norms and values of those people. They encode it as laws, saying that the state is obligated to carry out those norms. And, typical example, murder by definition is wrongful killing. It's not, so when it's not, you don't kill or you don't murder because it's unlawful. You don't murder because it's wrong. and we've encoded that into law to reflect that viewpoint. There are, even under law, there are justifiable killing, which are not murder. And we also recognize other, accidents, for example, manslaughter, which is generally not considered quite as moralistic, but it recognizes that some wrong or harm has been done, and the law is recognizing that.
Well, I mean, you raise this interesting point because I think I've mentioned to you before in some of our our board meetings, or maybe even on the telephone, or maybe even with the Dahl family a couple of weeks ago, that I have had a terrible, really crisis in my life where I have become alienated from my lifetime church affiliation of my family, which was very important to me throughout my life, from the time I was a little boy on through adulthood, because I've finally accepted that the view of the modern Episcopal Church is that basically, for having beliefs like yours and Bill Johnson's and Sam Dixon's, I am engaged in sin. I am a sinner.
Stop it.
I am a. I mean, well, I mean, I what I stopped was
I believe what we're doing is morally correct.
I stopped going to church, and I'm just saying that this is how fractured our world has become, because the Episcopal Church is the descendant of the Church of England, just as the United States is the descendant of England as the mother country. And the Church of England was the very first national church in the explicitly they call it the Church of England because the Queen was the King, or the Queen was the head of the head of the church, replaced the Pope, and national identity and church identity and Anglo-Saxon identity were all rolled up into sort of one beautiful bundle. As one of my favorite preachers in, of all places, Beverly Hills, California, explained it, the third Sunday of Advent is called Pink Sunday because you burn a pink candle. And he was explaining the odd connotations of pink, and he said, "Pink is the color of our skin. We are English." Look at me, I mean, I am kind of pink. He wasn't wrong about this at all. He was terminated for saying that there was identity between the English people and the Church of England in the United States, known as the Episcopal Church. Now that
What year was that?
19, no, I'm sorry. I always start to say 19, but it was actually 2013.
I think we have to recognize that all of the institutions, excuse me, all of the institutions in the West have been basically subverted since World War II. This is my viewpoint anyways, and it's that there was an elite which conducted and, well, organized the societies because they had, in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt organized a war effort and grabbed control of the whole society through war powers. They controlled all of the means of public communications through various means, including regulation, and censorship methods. And so they've basically made themselves authorities where they're not, I believe. I don't believe that they are authorities, but so all of our institutions have been infiltrated or subverted. They no longer represent the Western interest, the Western mind, and we need to change that. We need to, one of two things. I mean, I'm no longer a reformist. I don't believe that we can reform these institutions, and we have to set up new institutions, but that's just my personal viewpoint.
Well, I mean, you raise an interesting question in regard to, I guess it's a form of philosophy and ethics. what is it that makes one group or one institution authoritative? I mean, you say that the basically you're saying that the government of the United States and the mainstream institutions like the Church of England, Episcopal Church, or the Southern Baptists for that matter, it's not just the Episcopalians, it's basically every mainstream Christian denomination, including the Roman Catholics, who used to be considered conservative and now they're like,
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
I mean, we have a Jesuit or a communist pope. I mean, he's not my pope, but whatever,
Yeah, well, I mean, there was this old expression: "Is the Pope Catholic?" And the answer is now no. Right. We don't know what he is, but whatever he is, he's celebrating Amazonian fertility rights in St. Peter's Square.
So let me answer your question. Where does these authorities come from? And I am a natural rights kind of guy. I believe that the ideology of in natural rights, and Thomas Jefferson, and this is off the top of my head, so I'm probably going to get it wrong, verbatim. But governments are instituted by men for men. Whenever any such government becomes hostile to the people and their way of life, then it is their right or duty to alter or abolish that. So in answer to your question, we give authority to institutions, we give authority to people, we give authority to ideas. And if we don't like the results of those, we can change who we're giving our authorities to. Now, I'm not calling for a seditious approach here. We can recognize that we have empowered the state to carry out and conduct rule of law, and we can recognize that as being authoritative, and I do. But we can also recognize that the state has certain limitations, that it does not have full moral authority and dictating to us who we are, what's good in life, and how we should be conducting our lives.
One of the big news items this week is actually related to this question of what is authority, what is sedition, and what is insurrection. I don't know if, since you have a full-time job, you probably haven't had time to sit down and read the 298 of the 213 pages in the Colorado Supreme Court's opinion about President Trump, but it has a section starting at page 98 on insurrection that basically says, here it quotes from the 1860 of all the years, in the 1860 dictionary definition of insurrection: a rising against civil or political authority, the open and active of a number of persons to the execution of law in a city or state. It is equivalent to sedition, all caps, except that sedition expresses a less extensive rising of citizens. It differs from rebellion, for the latter expresses a revolt or an attempt to overthrow the government, to establish a different one, or to place the country under another jurisdiction. So you said you're not a seditionist, or you are a seditionist?
I am not.
Okay, you're saying that to try to keep the FBI away from your door?
I'm saying that we have authorized the government, and it rightfully so has the obligation to carry out laws that we've put in place through our representatives. Now, where they fail to do that, then we've got a grievance that we have to address. So there are lots of different ways to address our grievances. Protest, speech. And specifically, let's talk about that case with Donald Trump. They're claiming sedition or whatever, but he's never been convicted on sedition, so they're presuming conviction and carrying out a sentence. So to me, that again, and I think the Supreme Courts will find that basically they overstepped their bounds of law, that they didn't have any justification for coming to a conclusion like they did because the facts didn't support it. So, that's a problem. That gets back to my earlier statement that, all of our institutions, the courts, for example, the legal system has been subverted by a number of parties in this country to serve their own ends, and specifically the left and some of the right, quote unquote, whatever that means, have, we know, for example, that some amount of ballot tampering goes on. So there is some amount of fraud going on, and people do utilize that to get themselves elected, quote unquote, or maybe not elected, but appear to be elected. So we have a number of grievances that we have to be working out with our government through our rightful means. That's why I say I'm not seditious, because I'm saying the law provides means for us to address these grievances.
Strange to say. I mean, the definition they just gave, was the election of Donald Trump itself arising against civil or political authority?
So following the laws and codes of election conduct, they're saying he broke the law.
Well, I'm just wondering. I mean, I'm looking at this authority that they cited. Again, it's on 98 of 213 of the Colorado Supreme Court's decision of December 19th, and it's worth everybody's time to look through this monstrous document, because it is going to shape dialogue throughout the coming year. And absolutely, it is fascinating to me because I was very distressed personally by the events of the 2020 election. I have watched over the course of my life a lot of presidential elections. The first one I actually remember was 1968, and I very vividly remember it because I came from a George Wallace family, and one of the strangest memories I have of that was that the eldest black maid that we had cheered loudly every time the returns for Wallace came in. Now, I didn't realize how strange that was at the time. I was just a little boy, but looking back on it, she cheered louder than any of the white people in the family.
That's the whole point. I mean, the old saying is bullets or ballots, right? So short of going to war and being at war, we utilize the ballot system to realize the kind of society that we want. Some people abuse that system to their own gain, or for example, and I think this is an important point to bring up. The Congress has made certain laws about immigration, and yet the President Biden, refuses to carry out the laws as they have been written. And in general, the case seems to be the Democrats in particular enforce which laws they want to enforce and ignore other laws. And that's just morally wrong. I mean, one, it's morally wrong, and two, I'll say it's legally wrong. And we as a people have been legally wronged by them not following the laws. Whether if they don't, they take oaths to carry out the laws as they've been established, and it's not up to them to decide which ones they get to enforce or not. So, we as a people, the American nation, have been aggrieved very poorly, very much, and we are legitimately angry at what's being imposed upon us by several parties, for whatever reason.
Well, and yet the strange thing is, you were quoting from the Declaration of Independence a few minutes ago, and
paraphrasing.
Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the government, but the truth is that the government derives all their powers, whether just or unjust, from the consent of the government, because if people truly didn't consent, then there would be more seditious insurrections, looking at this fascinating opinion here. And the funny thing is that you and I may be disturbed by immigration, and every member of our board, and maybe every member of our audience, for all I know, is actually disturbed by what's going on in Arizona, for instance. How far from the border do you live?
50 miles.
50 miles. And do you feel
illegal aliens are being ferried from the border and taken to the airport here in town, and then flown out and sent somewhere else around the country? Now let's talk about what at least as I understand it, the legal basis for doing that. They're claiming. So again, remember I said there are a number of treaties the U.S. has signed, and as a product of those treaties, we agree to recognize refugee status. So now, the legal, what our actual obligations are often not well defined. But the president of the United States is saying, well, we've got these laws and treaties. Therefore, if somebody wants to make a claim of being a refugee, we must recognize it. Well, that's not entirely true. What Trump was doing was saying, well, we'll recognize it, but we'll keep them in Mexico until they've been processed and that their claims of refugee status have been proven to be correct. And in fact, the law says that refugees are required to go to the first country that will accept them, and that would actually be Mexico. So but right. Under law, they would be required to stay in Mexico, contact our embassies, be processed as a refugee, and then we could accept them. But Biden is not accepting the law. He's basically saying, well, I'm just going to accept them in. I'm going to let them all in. I've let in how many, 8 to 10 million people, and they're all refugees. They said they were. Well, it's worse than that, because there are numerous organizations out there that are coaching these so-called refugees, these illegal aliens. There are some Soros-backed organizations and United Nations-backed organizations which are funding and organizing the effort, providing them the basis under which they could claim refugee status, which doesn't mean that they are refugees, because that has a very specific meaning. And then they're coming up here and they've already been trained in school, so they just say, I'm a refugee. And then now this administration, again, rather than following the laws, is saying, oh, they're refugees, we have to let them in the country. Well, no, they don't. But anyway, that's the grievance that we as Americans have, that our rights to self-determination are being violated by this complete abrogation of their responsibility to follow the law.
How is the presence in the United States of, you said 8 million, I don't know if it's 6, 8, 10, 14. There could be as many as 20 million.
I'm just saying since the Biden regime came to power, that number, as I recognize it, is 8 to 10 million, and that's 8 to 10 million documented cases. But there's many other undocumented cases, so I wouldn't be surprised if it's higher than that. The total number, illegals, whatever you want to call them, could be on the order of 20 million. I believe I just saw an article not too long ago saying that the number of foreign-born people in this country is higher than it's ever been. So the United States government is, again, in my opinion, abrogating its responsibility to recognize our rights to self-determination, and bringing in these foreigners because it wants them in for whatever reason. It represents the interests of at least a few elite, either because they want standing on the world political stage, or because corporate interests want cheap labor to push down domestic wages. So I believe those are the key reasons why this is going on, because every poll that I've seen suggests that people do not want this kind of level of immigration occurring. I mean, even now, I think it was just even this morning, I saw an article where even Hispanics are very dissatisfied with the Democrat Party because of their position. And I've known numerous Hispanics who were very dissatisfied with the way that we're failing to enforce our immigration laws.
This is a totally different angle, or maybe it's not, but uh, is it possible that the motivation for bringing in millions of non-white immigrants is to cause an insurrection?
So I believe the answer is yes. I believe
So,
it's twofold. I mean, one is whether they want to admit it or not, they hate us. They are going out of their way to impose living conditions which will result in our destruction. And two, yeah, what you suggested.
insurrection is distinguished from rout, riot, and offenses connected with mob violence by the fact that in insurrection, there is an organized and armed uprising against authority or operations of government, while crimes growing out of mob violence, however serious they may be and however numerous the participants, are simply unlawful acts in disturbance of the peace, which do not threaten the stability of the government or the existence of political society. I mean, I remember on January 6th being sort of shocked at how completely peaceful and ineffective they were. I mean, we have seen over our lifetimes, you mentioned Watts in the 1960s. You didn't mention Chicago in 68. You didn't mention LA in 1992. There have been some major riots. And of course, as far as I can tell, nothing in history has been as big as the George Floyd riots. That is basically the most widespread and the most organized and up to a point armed uprising against authority or operations of government, to use the language that the Colorado Supreme Court is quoting from Westlaw of all places. They are quoting this. Oh, I guess it's from Corpus Juris Secundum in on Westlaw. And how is it that the mainstream media, and up to a point, the whole country, is not deeply offended by the fact that the George Floyd rioters, Black Lives Matter rioters, got off essentially scot-free? I mean, I'm sure there were a few random arrests here and there, but certainly no mass arrests, and certainly no systematic ferreting out of every last person who was, anywhere near the Capitol on January 6th, the way there has been. They've even arrested people who weren't there at all on conspiracy.
I think it's important to realize that when you say mainstream media, quote unquote, that is a corporate media. And the corporate media, which constitutes fully 90% of all media sources in this country, are owned by 6 corporations. So that rather than being a wide variety of differing viewpoints in quote unquote the media, specifically the mainstream media, that represents a very small percentage of people. You could take those 6 corporations, count the people on their boards of directors, and say that's the viewpoint represented by the quote unquote mainstream media. But there's plenty of other media out there, which is not quote unquote mainstream. And that's the exciting thing about the internet. The internet has opened up avenues of communication for much more different forms of news to be distributed. And they're afraid of that. Those corporate media, and in many cases, that corporate media reflects merely the viewpoint of the Democrat Party. they're very afraid and are doing everything they can to shut down alternate media sources. I mean, you're seeing, quote unquote, hate speech or any manner of what was it? 90, the not Computer Decency Act.
Communications Decency Act, related to the doll case that you were on the couple of weeks ago.
Right. So they've utilized that to basically shut down many different viewpoints and information sources down to just a few that they control. In the past, now you and I are older than probably much of the audience. When we grew up, there was there was two major news sources, AP and UPI, and those voices were expressed through three major media outlets: ABC, CBC, NBC. Maybe you could throw in, and then in the 80s and 90s,
NPR,
MSNBC and NPR came along. But NPR is also very heavily government funded, so
primarily
very
government
compromised.
Funded, yes. Yeah.
One other thing, which again, all right, I'll put on my tinfoil hat. Many people may not agree with this, but there have been known programs where the CIA has infiltrated the media organizations in the U.S. It specifically is called Project Mockingbird. They testified before Congress that, oh yeah, we're funding specific messaging and specific people to be in positions in media to express the viewpoint that they wanted. So there's that the media is really not as independent as they claim to be. And then what was it? The Smith-Mundt Act was allowed to sunset, I believe it was 2013, which disallowed the U.S. government from propagandizing the American populace. Well, that's not the law anymore. So now, by law, the U.S. government can propagandize the American public. So people need to be very critical of who's saying what and what they're saying. That there could be, that may not represent real news, quote unquote, that it represents the viewpoints and narratives of a very few select number of people. I believe that's true. It's very obvious. If you go on places like, well, first of all, YouTube, if you say the wrong words, you'll be shadow banned. That's
or possibly actually banned.
Yeah.
I don't know if you keep up with Simon Webb, UK. History Debunked.
Yeah.
Did you know that he was banned from YouTube for a week?
I didn't know that.
He was suspended for a week, and he keeps talking about it, and he says, "I can't say why because they'll ban me again." Right. He can't even explain why he was banned for a week, but basically he and I mean I can't use my name or my face in an official profile on Facebook. It's kind of interesting. I until about a year and a half ago, I had three profiles that I had almost since the beginning of Facebook, and now I sort of go under a pseudonym without my picture. And
I just refuse to use them. I don't use Facebook, Twitter. I just don't use those. I mean, there are alternate ways of communicating. Our own podcast here, despite the fact that it will probably show on YouTube, it'll also show on other sites.
Well, it's primarily sponsored by Speak Free Radio, but that's actually something that I've been meaning to talk to you about. I was hoping we could get it on Rumble or Odyssey to go simultaneously. I don't have the technical ability to podcast to figure out how to do that. So we need to talk about that at some stage, but that's not really the subject of this podcast.
Sure.
Looking back on history, and I always try to do a little bit of a look back every day on some of the major events. Again, in regard to legitimacy of authority, I think one of the most interesting anniversaries today is the Alfred Dreyfus case. Are you familiar with that?
Not really. If I remember properly, wasn't that in France?
It was in France, and basically, it was one of the first episodes in which a Jewish person basically used the media and the court system together to great advantage, or the Jewish community on behalf of a Jewish person used the media and the courts to great advantage. He was originally convicted of treason and sentenced to life in prison on this day, December 22nd of 1894. So that was in our This Day in History feed. And it's fascinating because I know of nobody in the white nationalist movement, or any other movement for that matter, who actually seems to think that Alfred Dreyfus was actually guilty. But it was like about 20 years before the Leo Frank case in Atlanta, for instance. And I know of very few people. I know of nobody in our movement at all who thinks that that Leo Frank was innocent, but I know of no one who thinks that Alfred Dreyfus was actually guilty. And so we have two cases where anti-Semitism was alleged as a grounds for subverting authority, and in the case of Leo Frank, of course, subverting mob violence, actual a very mild form of insurrection or sedition, according to these definitions here. The people of Atlanta did not agree with the result that the court had reached of sentencing this man to life in prison instead of hanging, and so they took him out and they hanged him. And what do you think about that kind of interaction? I mean, the legitimacy of authority from the media to the courts, and then an interaction between courts and media. Does that present any ethical problems?
I mean, my initial answer is I don't really have much of an opinion on it. Let's.
Well, I mean, it's just the historical antecedent for what we're looking at with Trump, for instance. It's right. Precisely the antecedent, because, I mean, basically what happened in Colorado is now a sensation in the mainstream media. They're all, yay! Cheering Colorado on. I mean, there may be very strange things going in Colorado. Colorado was, after all, I believe, the very first state to legalize recreational cannabis. I mean, we may have a totally drug-fueled Supreme Court over there. It would be both amusing and disturbing if that were true, but it is possible. And yet that decision. Another interesting thing about this case to me, with my background in law, is that the Supreme Court of Colorado admits that a lot of the evidence against Trump, a lot of the evidence that he engaged in an insurrection or sedition, comes from the media and from reports which constitute a big controversial label in law, hearsay. And hearsay is normally not enough to convict anybody. It's not enough to get a judgment in your favor in a civil case. It's normally just excluded, but they are basically saying that it was enough in this case that hearsay established that he was guilty of insurrection. And they basically say that they dedicated about 25% of substantial evidence in the record further established that this use of force was concerted and public. And I mean, they go around quoting newspapers.
So they're just making stuff up. Is what my view is. In particular, in that particular case, they're just making stuff up and they're using that as justification for carrying out their judicial activity, judicial activism, in fact. I think, you know, a real court of law would take quite about a time to determine whether or not that really was an insurrection, and and on the other hand, that he was involved with it, because legally, you know, I think he did what he needed to do, publicly stating, you know, let's be peaceable, let's follow the laws, you know, let's, you know, carry out our right to petition the government for grievances. I think that, you know, I don't believe that he stepped out of bounds. We do know now, though, that, you know, the government had a number of their agents who were explicit instigators. The latest videos that have been released demonstrate that, you know, and in fact, one of the, I think it was either the FBI director or one of the congressmen said that there are approximately 200, at least 200 FBI infiltrators involved in that activity, trying to and instigating the crowds. So we don't know. You know, we do know this. Trump didn't walk up to those fences. He was not on location. He did call for people to peaceably assemble, to peaceably march, and peaceably express their right to have their grievances addressed. So I believe under a court of law, we'll find him absolved of insurrection. But you know, the Democrats aren't waiting for that. They're not waiting for. If anything, this is a legal lynching, because before the laws before the legal system has had the opportunity to establish that it is insurrection, they're just presuming it is and moving forward.
You know, you mentioned earlier in the podcast that you think that since World War II, were you talking about the media or the general institutions?
General institutions. One good source, Diana West, has written a number of books on the subject. She started investigating. I mean, just for example, and again, this is questionable, was Eleanor Roosevelt a socialist? My understanding was she was. So the First Lady was a socialist. And then Alger Hiss was a communist infiltrator. And she points out in her books that if you examine it, you know, basically the presidential cabinet was largely communists. So the communists had infiltrated the federal government at the presidential or executive level during World War II. And then you had the whole quote unquote Red Scare, which wasn't a scare at all, because the communists really had infiltrated many different institutions. And in fact, their stated plan, you know, if is their quote unquote long march through the institutions. Their stated plan is to infiltrate institutions and subvert them and convert them over to be promoting Marxist philosophies.
In very strong support of what you're saying, do you know who Henry Agard Wallace was?
Sorry, I don't.
Henry Agard Wallace was the Vice President of the United States during the third Roosevelt term, which was the entirety of World War II, of our involvement in World War II, anyhow. Henry Agard Wallace was a card-carrying communist. He was endorsed by the CPUSA for president, but in 44, CPUSA nominated Franklin D. Roosevelt. And of course, this is just totally outside of the history books, but I guess not totally, because I did learn it from a book. I learned it from a book on the history of political parties in the United States that had a copy of all the party platforms in the United States. And actually, Henry Agard Wallace was totally... He traveled to Russia several times in the 30s. He was part of the support group that endorsed prioritizing aid to Russia over any other project. I mean, Russia could not have fought the Wehrmacht without United States help. And and so we saved ourselves. We saved Russia in order that we could have a Red Scare in the 50s.
Yeah.
There could have been no Red Scare in the 50s if Soviet Russia had fallen. And so, I mean, it all seems like a very elaborate ballet and dance, and there are just so many events in history that earlier this week I was talking, for instance, about the hero of the desegregation movement, John Minor Wisdom. Don't you love that name, John Minor Wisdom? The main Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals courthouse down on Lafayette Square is named after him. He was like the judge of the Fifth Circuit who single-handedly implemented desegregation over the will of the people in the American South. Those same five states that went for Goldwater, as a matter of fact. And he was Jewish, and he was also one of the people in the 1952 conventions who guaranteed the election of Dwight D. Eisenhower by securing Dwight Eisenhower's nomination over Robert Taft of Ohio, who was one of the people who had criticized the Nuremberg verdict. And we're running out of time, so I just wanted to say also that the Nuremberg verdict and the Nuremberg not just the verdict, but the trial itself and the rules of court are provide a very interesting precedent for what's going on in Colorado and elsewhere. The Nuremberg court was set up by the Allies, of course, in 1945, and they expressly abolished the hearsay rule in Nuremberg, and they expressly authorized the use of newspapers and media sources as evidence against all defendants. And so this is it's just very interesting to see that. I mean, that is one way in which World War II really did transform the psyche, because it was so important to convict the German high command and then thousands of people down below that things like the rules of evidence were suspended, and every kind of basically gossip and abuse was admitted. And that's exactly what the Supreme Court of Colorado has done here. And yet it's going to be promoted and publicized by the media as a triumph of democracy. And I'm going to let you have the rest of the the final words here, because I just say that, and I'm looking at it on the screen, and it drives me nuts.
Well, I just like to point out, I mean, I've read a lot of leftist literature, and I mean, there was books such as The Care and Feeding of the White Liberal, but the left knows that they could not use democracy to advance their agenda, so they purposely focused on subverting the courts and the legal system, and that's where we are today.
Well, Merry Christmas, Ed,
Merry Christmas.
Bucce, and I look forward to having you again on here. And in the meantime, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Sail on the Flying Dutchman. It's amazing where we are in history. Good night, everybody, from Louisiana and Arizona, two states that went for